Matthew 16:13 through 20 are the reading for today. Jesus came to Caesarea Philippi. Then he put this question to his disciples: "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" "John the Baptist," they replied. "Others say Elijah. Others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "What about you?" he asked them. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God." "God's blessing on you, Simon, son of John," answered Jesus. "Flesh and blood didn't reveal that to you. It was my Father in heaven. And I've got something to tell you too. You are Peter, the rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell won't overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you tie up on earth will have been tied up in heaven, and whatever you untie on earth will have been untied in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let's pray for a moment. Thank you for this opportunity to gather together in this assembly. Father, today, I pray your presence would be present with us in a special way this morning and draw us closer to each other and closer to you in Christ's name. Amen. All right. This is a fairly familiar passage to a lot of us, I'm sure. This phrase that's in the text today, "the gates of Hades will not prevail," the Greek word is actually Hades, not hell. Some translations use the word hell. I tend to like to use the Greek word because, as we've studied here before, there are several different Greek words that get translated as the singular English word hell, which confuses the issue. Hell is such a loaded word in contemporary culture. It has all kinds of meaning and baggage on it. Hades just means the place of the dead, the place where the dead people go. So as we're working through this passage today, just keep that in mind. It did have other meanings to other societies, and we'll deal with one of those today as well. This phrase, though, "the gates of Hades will not prevail," has been used and is often used, and I have used it, as kind of a call to prayer or a call to battle, a call to arms even, as Christians sometimes, if they're up against some kind of a struggle, sometimes Christians will identify that struggle as coming from hell, coming from Satan in some way, coming from evil, and they'll use this phrase, "the gates of hell can't prevail over this circumstance." I'm not sure how legitimate that is in this case, knowing that Hades is just the place where dead people go. But that being as it may, we are called to spiritual warfare, and so that's okay. So it is part of Jesus' reply to Peter about the role of the church, the ecclesia, which just means an assembly of believers. Some people have tried to make the ecclesia into a ruling council. I don't think that's legitimate. I think when Jesus speaks of the ecclesia, yes, in the Greek world, the Roman and Greek world at that time, the ecclesia was a ruling council. But Jesus stands everything on its head. He repeatedly uses language that was familiar to people, but he subverts that language, and in the context we realize he means something different from it. So you have whole swaths of the church today trying to implement a hierarchy in the church based on the Greek usage of the word ecclesia in the first century, not recognizing that Jesus subverted that and made all of us really equal in the kingdom of God. So we certainly all have different gifts, and we're privileged to exercise those gifts in this body, but that doesn't make us better or higher than anyone else. So I think the message will be a little shorter than usual, but who knows today. I have less slides than I usually have. That doesn't necessarily mean I'll talk less than I usually do, but we'll see. So we're starting at verse 13 in Matthew 16. "Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that the Son of Man is?'" The district of Caesarea Philippi. So the events leading up to this, and we've covered a number of them in the last few weeks, all took place around the Sea of Galilee. The feeding of the 5,000, Jesus walking on water, was on the Sea of Galilee. His teaching about what makes a person clean and unclean, which we've talked about, was there on the sea, next to the Sea of Galilee. The encounter we talked about last week with the Canaanite woman who pled with Jesus to heal her daughter of demon oppression happened there too. All of these things, these events leading up to this text today, happen on or around the Sea of Galilee. But Jesus doesn't ask this question about his identity to his disciples there, where all of this amazing stuff has just happened. He doesn't stop in the middle of all of that. After he healed the Canaanite woman's daughter, he went to the Decapolis, fed 4,000 Gentiles there, and healed a whole bunch of them too. So you would think right there, after this kind of greatest hits of miraculous stuff, that would be the time when Jesus would ask his disciples, so who do people think I am? After all of this long litany of amazing things that he'd just done. But he doesn't do it there. He goes to Caesarea Philippi to ask them this question. So that raises the question, where is Caesarea Philippi? So I'm glad you asked. You see down at the bottom is the Sea of Galilee there. And way up in the north, 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, is Caesarea Philippi. That's 25 miles from the north end of the Sea of Galilee, where the events we were just talking about happened down in the central part of the Sea of Galilee. So Jesus took his disciples on probably a 30 to 32 mile hike before asking this question, up to this area, Caesarea Philippi. Why would Jesus take his disciples 25 or 30 miles north of where he did almost all of his ministry to ask this question about how they understood his identity, who he is? Well, let's first find out a little bit about Caesarea Philippi. At Caesarea Philippi, there's a large cliff, and there's a cave in the face of the cliff. I'll show you pictures of it in a moment. And at the time, there was a really large spring that flowed up from inside that cliff and out the front of the cave. The water is not flowing out from that direction. I think the groundwater level has depleted to the extent that there is still water flowing out of the bedrock around there, but the spring isn't flowing like it was 2,000 years ago. Going back in history, the Canaanites had worshipped Baal here. The Greeks then, when they conquered the Babylonians, renamed the area Panias for their god Pan. And then the Romans, when they conquered the Greeks in this area, renamed it Caesarea Philippi. The reason they named it that is Caesarea is in reference to Caesar. Philippi was the second name of Herod Philip. Herod Philip was the son of Herod the Great. So the combination, kind of like Dover Foxcroft, of two words, is to combine the remembrance of Caesar and the local kind of puppet ruler that Caesar had instituted and put in place in this region, Herod Philip. It was a military outpost city for the Roman Empire in the time of Jesus. So Jesus deliberately takes his disciples away from the Sea of Galilee, north 25 or 30 miles to a Roman military outpost to ask this question. It's near the foot of Mount Hermon, which is the highest mountain in the region, over 9,000 feet, almost twice as high as Mount Katahdin. It's the highest mountain in the whole section of Palestine and Israel there. It was the location of repeated military battles and conquests. The Canaanites were defeated by the Syrians. The Seleucids then defeated the Syrians. And then the Romans come in later. So after each military conquest, the victors instituted worship of their particular gods here in Caesarea Philippi. And that's why the name changed over time. Now, if you look on a map, it's called Banias. It's like Panias with a B, so it's retained that pan god reference even in its modern name. And after each military conquest, the victors would institute worship of their gods here at this place. The rock face in this cliff has been carved with niches. So you see the cave opening there where the spring was originally inside that cave. And then over the years, there have been niches carved into the rock face, and then idols or images of the various gods of the different military conquests were placed in these niches, these archways, for people to worship there. The spring inside the cave made a pool, and the pool was so deep they couldn't determine the depth of the pool. So kind of mysterious. Inside a cave, a dark place, and there's a pool there. Water keeps gushing out of the pool, and they couldn't even determine the depth. So the area had a great political and religious significance. Now, the political and religious spheres at the time were not thought of separately, like we try to do today, although we're not very good at it still. We still tend to link our religion and our politics, don't we? Sometimes we're not aware of it, but at the time, 2,000 years ago, there was not even an attempt to separate the religious from the political. They were all intertwined with one another. The political leaders were considered gods or sons of the gods. That's why even on the coinage of the times, Caesar's image was on the coin, and it said Son of God on the coin. How this site likely appeared in the first century is something like this. There's a large stone cliff face there. Over on your left, you see a shrine to Augustus Caesar that was built in front of the cave opening. There was another shrine, I forget who that was for, a couple other shrines there. Niches in the rocks with idols and god figures placed in them. The god Pan was worshipped here by the Greeks. The god Pan was part man and part goat. Was a god of fertility, and the site for many years was a site of very perverted religious sexual acts in worship of the Pan god. The Jewish rabbis at the time of Jesus forbade Jews from going here. So Jesus is being a little bit subversive here in that he takes his disciples to a place where the rabbis forbade Jews to go, but Jesus deliberately takes his disciples there. Brian McLaren, a few years ago, wrote a book called Everything Must Change, and in that book he comments about this. So I'll read you a little bit of what he writes. For Jesus to lead his disciples to this city would be an intentional move, evoking many layers of meaning, perhaps akin to a leader today bringing his followers to Auschwitz, Hiroshima, Soweto, or the Gaza Strip. So this Jewish prophet and his band of closest friends come to the foreign city named for the occupying emperor and a puppet regional ruler, that's Caesar and Herod Philip, the site of a battle that led to some of Israel's worst days, and a location known as a center for the worship of false gods. Very possibly in the shadow of the cliff face, with its idols set into their finely carved niches, Jesus asks, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" So again, Jesus doesn't ask this question after feeding the multitudes or after walking on water or after healing many people. He asks about his identity at a place of great religious and military significance, a place of idol worship. And the disciples answer him in the beginning by saying, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. So people have taken that passage to contend that the Jews believed in reincarnation. And I don't think that's what it means. I think it means that they saw people being modern-day equivalents of past figures. Jesus said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah or the Christ, the Son of the living God." So Christ is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah, and it just means liberating king. So Christ or Messiah mean the same thing. It's not Jesus' last name. It's not Jesus Christ. It's not his surname. It means it's his title, liberating king. So Brian continues to write and says, to say that Jesus is a liberating king anywhere in the Roman Empire is dangerous, even more so in a city bearing Caesar's name. You are King Jesus, who will liberate us from King Caesar. You are the liberator promised by God long ago, the one for whom we have long waited. Similarly, Son of the living God takes on special radiance in this setting. Caesars called themselves sons of the gods. But Peter's confession asserts that their false idolatrous claim is now trumped by Jesus' true identity as one with authority from the true and living God. So this is a bit of a dangerous statement in this location to be making this confession about who Jesus is, about his identity. It's flying directly into the face of the Roman authority. And then Jesus responds to Peter. It says, and Jesus answered, Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. So Jesus commends Peter for his confession. Then in verse 18 he says, You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. So Catholics have understood this to mean that Peter is the rock that the church is then to be built upon. So Catholics trace their popes all the way back to Peter, understanding him to be this rock that Jesus is referring to here. Protestants, of course, have understood this differently. They think it's Peter's confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, that is the rock that the church is to be built on. That it's this statement that Peter makes. But there might be another way to understand what Jesus is saying here to Peter. Standing here in front of what's called the rock of the gods, that whole stone face is called the rock of the gods, where for centuries false gods had been worshipped, and where empires had placed shrines to their god kings, and where the current empire, Rome, had built a shrine to Caesar. I wonder if Jesus might be saying something about all of this. Maybe he's trying to draw all of this history into his response to Peter. Remember, he's taken them 25 or 30 miles to this place to ask this question. I wonder if he's saying something about all of this history. The cave opening where the spring bubbled out of was actually understood by the Canaanites to be the place where Baal entered and left the underworld. And they named it the gates of Hades. So this place today, even if you look it up on Wikipedia, it will identify that cave opening as the gates of Hades, which curiously is what Jesus includes in his statement to Peter. So you have Jesus asking, Who do you say that I am? In front of the rock of the gods, and which contains the gate of Hades. And then he commends Peter by saying, On this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. Kind of a big image lesson going on here, huh? He brought his disciples 25 miles north to the rock of the gods, where the rabbis had forbidden Jews to go, to a place of great historical significance in the history of Israel and the history of other ungodly empires, a place where kings and gods had been honored for centuries, a place where the worst of idol worship and debauchery were celebrated. And here, when Jesus refers to a rock on which he will build his church, with the rock of the gods looming in the background, and in which is the gate of Hades, there's more than just a little symbolism going on. There's more than just a hint about how universal his mission is to be, and the mission of the church is to be. There's a blog online called Fishing the Abyss. I don't know too much about it, but I appreciated what he had to say about this. He says, might it be possible that he took his disciples to the most degenerate place possible to say to them, this is where I want you to build my church. I want you to go out into the repugnantly degenerate places where God is not even known. And that is where I want you to build my church. Because that is exactly what they did. They went to places in Asia Minor and the ends of the earth where gods were worshipped in unspeakably awful manners, and where Christians would be persecuted in a horrific manner, and they gave their lives doing exactly what they were told to do by their rabbi. Then Jesus continues saying to Peter, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. So this passage is often used, and I've used it, to bind evil spirits and to loose blessings on people. You guys have all been involved in those kind of prayer meetings, right? Perhaps that is a legitimate understanding. Here in the shadow of the rock of the gods, with the gate of Hades over his shoulder, binding evil spirits could be a legitimate interpretation, I suppose. But Andrew Marr is interesting. He's a monk, actually. I met him in Chicago at the conference I went to this year. He wrote a book called Moving and Resting in God's Desire. And he suggests that we consider at least another way that we might understand this. When we use these words binding and loosing, charismatics have tended to think of that only in terms of somehow putting evil spirits in chains and loosing something good to happen. Andrew suggests that we think about loosing in the context of forgiveness, because when you forgive someone, you loose them from their obligation to you. You set them free. You cut those ties that bind you to the person that hurt you, right? As long as you have unforgiveness, you're bound to the person that hurt you. But when you forgive them, that tie is cut, it's loosed. So this is just another way we might think of this. Andrew writes, wait a minute, aren't we told that those we loose on earth are loosed in heaven, and those who are bound on earth are bound in heaven? Sounds like we have the power to bind other people for all eternity, and God's hands are tied for as long as we want them to be. Have you thought about it that way? I've questioned this before. But then he says, how much power is that? Not so fast. So he's saying, here's one way you can think about this, that if Jesus gave us authority to bind and loose, and whatever we bind on earth is bound in heaven, then it sounds like God has given us more authority than even he has, right? So he's saying, well, that's one way that we could look at it, but he says, wait a minute, not so fast. Why is it that we so easily assume we are being allowed, even encouraged, to bind on earth? Why are we slower to see that maybe we are being encouraged to loose on earth? Let's return to Peter's question about how many times he must forgive, and Jesus' parable to the unforgiving debtor. If we have to forgive others as God forgives us, and that without limit, which is what 77 times means, then we are indeed being encouraged to loose on earth. We are being warned that if we do not loose on earth, we are bound to our resentment for what others have done to us or what we think they have done to us. If we remain bound to our resentments, we will be so bound even in heaven, since God's hands are indeed tied for as long as we refuse to let God untie us. Truly accepting this free gift of forgiveness entails passing this free gift on to others. We are all thrown into the same world together. The question is whether we will be tied up in vengeance or bound with others by forgiveness. Today's text finishes with Jesus ordering his disciples not to tell anyone that he is the Messiah. He still had a lot to do. I think he knew that people had very loaded understandings of that term Messiah or Christ, and that he still had much to do to correct those understandings, those misunderstandings. So next week we'll continue with this text with the passage about Jesus then beginning to tell them what he must suffer, that he said, we're going back to Jerusalem and the Son of Man is going to suffer a lot of things. And Peter jumps in and says, no, it'll never be. Can you see what's happening here? And then Jesus rebukes him says, "Get behind me, Satan." We'll talk about that passage next week. But I'm interested to hearing what you guys think about now that we know the contextual location where Jesus took his disciples to ask this question about his identity and to hear their response. Does that impact your understanding of this passage? Do you think any differently about this passage than maybe you did not understanding where and the history of the location where Jesus asked it? And what does the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church mean now that we know where and it was spoken and in what the context of that place was? Okay.